Imagine the ground shaking beneath the feet of leaders who thought they were untouchable, a name echoing like distant thunder, heralding a storm that promises to sweep away corruption and redraw the map of power. Africa will never be the same again. If you like stories that move us and make us reflect on the world, this is the place for you. Click subscribe and activate the bell to follow each chapter of this journey, and many others to come. Deep in the depths of an African nation, where the sun kissed the earth with fervor but hope seemed to have dried up under the yoke of greed, a man watched in silence. This man, who would come to be known as IBRAHIM TRAORÉ, was not a prince born with a silver spoon in his mouth, nor a cunning politician trained in the arts of deception, but a son of the people, someone who felt firsthand the pain and humiliation inflicted by those he was supposed to protect but instead plundered. He saw the rivers of wealth flowing away, while schools remained without books and hospitals without medicine, a bitter reality that corroded the soul of the nation. The palaces of the rulers, built with the sweat and tears of the forgotten, shone with an insulting luxury, in stark contrast to the misery that spread through the towns and cities. IBRAHIM carried in his heart the weight of this injustice, the silent indignation of millions who no longer dared to dream. He saw the young without a future, the elderly without support, and in each hopeless face he saw a reflection of the betrayal committed by the leaders. This daily observation fed a flame in his chest, a determination that grew with each new corruption scandal, with each empty promise that echoed through the corridors of power. It was not a single event, but the accumulation of countless wounds that finally drove him. Perhaps it was the sight of a mother weeping for a child lost to a curable disease, or an elderly man selling his last possessions for a handful of grain. Or perhaps it was the inordinate arrogance of a minister riding in imported cars down potholed roads, indifferent to the suffering around him. Whatever the final trigger, the decision was made deep within him, a solemn promise that complicit silence would reign no more as long as he could breathe and fight for real and lasting change. Then one day, his voice broke the oppressive silence, not with the fury of a lion, but with the piercing clarity of a truth long suppressed. Through a community radio station, with a modest reach but an immense impact, his words began to spread, questioning the unquestionable, challenging the established power. He spoke not of revenge, but of justice. He did not incite hatred, but unity for dignity. His message was simple, direct, and echoed the deepest desires of a people tired of being invisible in the eyes of their rulers. At first, those in power, ensconced in their fortresses of privilege, barely noticed. To them, it was just another whisper of discontent, easily squelched, like so many others before it. They dismissed it as insignificant, a mosquito buzzing in the vastness of their absolute control, not realizing that the buzzing was the harbinger of a storm. They underestimated the depth of popular pain and the ability of an ordinary man, armed only with truth and courage, to awaken the dormant conscience of an entire nation. But IBRAHIM's words, filled with palpable sincerity, found fertile soil in hearts thirsting for hope. It began as a murmur in the markets, a hesitant conversation between neighbors, a knowing look exchanged in long lines for basic services. The seed of change, planted by his courage, began to germinate slowly, nourished by the accumulated hopelessness and the sudden realization that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. People began to listen more attentively, to discuss his ideas in secret, feeling a spark of something new. Small acts of resistance began to emerge, almost imperceptible at first. A makeshift poster appeared on a wall, a quote from IBRAHIM spray-painted on a wall, a group of students openly debating his words. They were drops of water, but they announced the formation of a powerful current. Each small gesture of defiance was a testament to the resonance of their message, proof that apathy was beginning to give way to a growing restlessness, a collective desire for real, tangible transformation in their daily lives. IBRAHIM TRAORÉ, aware of the dangers his boldness entailed, did not back down. He knew that the path he had chosen was arduous and fraught with pitfalls, that the forces he was challenging were implacable, and would not hesitate to crush him. But the vision of a future where his people could hold their heads high with dignity, where children could dream and the elderly could rest in peace, drove him on. This inner strength, this unshakable conviction, was his armor against the fear and intimidation that would surely come. A different wind was blowing over the nation, an air of anticipation and apprehension. No one knew for sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, there was a sense that the status quo was not immutable. Ibrahim Traoré's voice had broken the spell of resignation, opening a crack in the wall of indifference. It was the harbinger of something bigger, a tectonic shift that was beginning to form beneath the seemingly calm surface of everyday life, preparing to shake the foundations of power. The echo of that solitary voice, initially disregarded, began to transform into a growing, albeit timid chorus. In the dusty alleys and vibrant markets, Ibrahim Traoré's name was whispered with a mixture of awe and admiration. He who dared to speak on behalf of the voiceless gradually became a symbol. He was living proof that courage could flourish even in the most arid soil of oppression, and that a single spark could indeed start a great fire in the collective consciousness. In the opulent halls of power, where expensive wine flowed and shady deals were sealed with conniving handshakes, the first news of Ibrahim Traoré came as a distant joke. The leaders, wrapped up in their own importance and the web of corruption they had woven, laughed scornfully. They considered him a naive dreamer, a crazed idealist who would soon be silenced by the harsh reality of the power they held with an iron fist. History, for them, was full of examples of rebels crushed, of dissenting voices drowned in oblivion. They firmly believed that the people, tamed by years of repression and occasional crumbs, would never rise up in any meaningful way. After all, they controlled the army, the police, the state media, and the machinery of justice. Any spark of rebellion would be quickly extinguished, they thought, with the same brutal efficiency they had demonstrated in the past. The people's short memories, or so they assumed, would ensure that old mistakes would be repeated and that the established order, so beneficial to them, would remain intact and unshakable for generations. They underestimated, however, the depth of despair that was building up like a dam about to burst. They did not understand that the patience of the people, although vast as the continent, had limits. They ignored the signs, the hardened looks, the silence that was not of consent but of contained anger, fermenting beneath the surface. For them, power was a divine right, and any challenge was heresy to be severely punished, without questioning the deep causes of that popular discontent. Their first attempts to silence Traoré were subtle, almost dismissive. Perhaps in order to shut down the community radio station for technical irregularities, or a discreet surveillance of his supposed supporters. They believed that a little pressure would be enough to intimidate him, to make him retreat into the obscurity from which he had come. They could not conceive of anyone being driven by anything other than fear or personal ambition, the only drivers they truly understood and masterfully manipulated. But Ibrahim's message had already found other, more sinuous and uncontrollable paths. It traveled by word of mouth, in secretly shared text messages, in amateur videos recorded on cell phones and distributed on social networks that escaped state control. Each attempt at censorship only amplified his voice, transforming him into a potential martyr, a forbidden hero whose legend grew with each new rumor, with each new failed attempt to erase him from the public consciousness. Then the first signs of real unrest began to emerge among the elite. A nervous glance exchanged over a sumptuous banquet, a conversation interrupted when a name was mentioned, the increased frequency of secret meetings behind closed doors. That pesky gnat was beginning to feel more like a persistent bee whose sting could be painful. The arrogant certainty was beginning to be corroded by a nagging doubt, an uncomfortable feeling that perhaps, this time, things might turn out differently than they had expected. They resorted to their old tactics, trying to divide and conquer, stoking old ethnic or regional rivalries, spreading disinformation to discredit Traoré and his followers. They promised empty investigations into corruption, offered positions to moderate opponents, trying to co-opt and neutralize the rising tide of discontent. But the people, tired of broken promises and cynical manipulations, were no longer so easily fooled, having learned from the hard lessons of the recent and distant past. Traoré's message of unity, which transcended artificially created divisions, proved surprisingly powerful and resilient. He spoke of a common identity, a shared destiny, a struggle that belonged to all oppressed citizens, regardless of their origin or belief. This inclusive narrative disarmed the divisive strategies of the leaders, who found themselves increasingly isolated in their ivory tower, while popular support for Traoré grew exponentially and worryingly. A chill ran down the spines of the rulers when they realized that their control, once so absolute, was beginning to show cracks. Orders were no longer carried out with the same promptness. The looks in his subordinates' eyes carried a hesitation that had not existed before. Loyalty, bought with money and privileges, proved fragile in the face of the rising tide of popular indignation. Fear, once their tool, began to creep into their own hearts. The first flash of genuine fear, the kind that chills the blood and tightens the chest, came when they saw the first images of crowds gathering spontaneously, not to protest for bread or work, but for dignity and justice, echoing the words of Ibrahim Traoré. This fear was quickly suppressed, disguised under a facade of firmness and control, but it was there, a seed of panic planted in the heart of corrupt power, waiting for the moment to blossom into despair. Ibrahim Traoré's words, like seeds in the wind, finally found the fertile soil of the people's soul, and there they blossomed into contagious courage. What had previously been whispers and furtive glances became open conversations, heated debates in the squares and universities. Hope, once a distant mirage, became a tangible possibility, and with it came the determination to fight for a future where justice was not just an empty word in official speeches, but a reality experienced by all. Small groups, inspired by the audacity of this common man who had dared to challenge giants, began to organize. First came the students, with their youthful energy and indomitable idealism, then the workers, tired of starvation wages while the nation's wealth was being siphoned off. Then came the mothers, worried about the future of their children, and the peasants, robbed of their lands and ancestral dignity. A web of resistance began to form, silent but powerful. The first demonstrations were timid, almost hesitant, as if the people were still testing the waters, measuring the reaction of the oppressive power. But with each day, with each new injustice revealed, with each new word of encouragement from Traoré that managed to break through the censorship blockade, more people joined in. The numbers grew exponentially, and the courage of one fed that of another, creating a virtuous cycle of collective empowerment that surprised even the most optimistic. Soon, the streets of major cities were filled with rivers of people. They were men and women, young and old, of all ethnicities and creeds, united by a single purpose: the end of corruption and the birth of a new era. They carried improvised banners with slogans that echoed Traoré's aspirations, sang songs of freedom that had been silenced for generations, and marched with a peaceful but unwavering determination that left the authorities perplexed and increasingly nervous. The symbolism of the protests was powerful. Flowers were offered to soldiers, who often looked away, torn between duty and conscience. Hands joined in human chains that surrounded government buildings, not with violence, but with the silent force of a massive presence. The colors of the national flag, once a symbol co-opted by the regime, were rediscovered as an emblem of popular sovereignty and the desire for a truly free and just country for all its children. The first major crackdown came like a bolt from the blue, brutal and indiscriminate, in an attempt to crush the movement in its infancy. Tear gas, batons and rubber bullets were used against peaceful protesters, leaving a trail of injuries and even greater indignation. But the effect was the opposite of what was expected. Instead of fear, state violence generated more anger, more determination and even stronger solidarity among those fighting for change. Stories of anonymous heroism began to circulate, of ordinary people protecting one another, of doctors and nurses treating the wounded at personal risk, of lawyers offering free defense to detainees. Each act of bravery, each sacrifice, became a building block in the construction of a new national consciousness. The regime's narrative, which tried to paint the protesters as vandals and agitators, lost strength in the face of the reality of peaceful resistance and the brutality of the repression. The tide of people in the streets became unstoppable, an ocean of citizens aware of their collective power. Cities came to a standstill, not because of chaos, but because of the peaceful occupation of public spaces. Workers crossed their arms, shopkeepers closed their doors in support, and even sectors of the state bureaucracy began to show sympathy for the popular cause, paralyzing the administrative machinery of the corrupt government and isolating it even further. An indescribable feeling of empowerment took hold of the population. For the first time in their lives, many felt that they were the protagonists of their own story, that their voices mattered, and that together they could tear down walls that seemed insurmountable. The fear that had paralyzed them for so long began to dissipate, replaced by the euphoria of rediscovered freedom and the responsibility of building a new tomorrow, brick by brick, with their own hands. The capital, the heart of power and corrupt opulence, found itself under siege, not by an invading army, but by its own citizens. The streets that had once witnessed the arrogant parade of the powerful now echoed with the chants of peaceful revolution. The presidential palace, once a symbol of unquestionable authority, now seemed like an isolated island, surrounded by a sea of popular demands that were demanding to be heard and met without further delay. The transformation was in full swing. Inside the palaces of marble and gold, the air that had once been thin with arrogance was now thick with palpable panic. The leaders who had only days before mocked the insignificance of IBRAHIM TRAORÉ and his followers now watched on giant screens, their eyes wide with disbelief and terror, as images of the streets filled with seemingly endless crowds rolled in. The ground that had once seemed so firm beneath their feet now shook with the force of the footsteps of millions of awakened citizens. Desperate phone calls were made in all directions. Generals were summoned, police chiefs urged to act more severely, but the answers were hesitant, evasive. Many of those who had once sworn eternal loyalty now feared staining their hands with the blood of the people, or simply realized that the balance of power was tipping dangerously in the other direction. Loyalty bought with dirty money was proving useless in the face of the righteous fury of an entire nation. In an act of desperation, some leaders tried to offer hasty concessions, promises of dialogue, investigations into corruption, the dismissal of some scapegoats. But it was too late, too little, and offered with the transparency of bad faith. The people, now aware of their strength and united in their purpose, did not want crumbs. They wanted the whole table. They wanted the restoration of their dignity, and the complete end of the system that had oppressed them for so long. Then the race to the bottom began. Some of the most notorious corrupt figures, feeling the noose tightening, tried to flee the country with their ill-gotten fortunes. Private jets were secretly prepared, suitcases stuffed with cash and jewelry were discreetly loaded. But many found airports closed by strikes by employees in solidarity with the protests, or roads blocked by popular roadblocks, their faces plastered on posters demanding justice, not escape. The panic generated paranoia and distrust among the members of the corrupt elite. Mutual accusations began to fly, each trying to save his own skin by blaming the others for the crisis he himself had created. The alliances of convenience, forged in the sharing of the loot, quickly fell apart in the face of imminent collapse. The solidarity of the thieves showed its true face, fragile and opportunistic, incapable of resisting the pressure of the truth. Former international allies, those foreign powers that had long tolerated or even supported corrupt regimes in exchange for access to resources and geopolitical influence, began to distance themselves. Vague diplomatic communiques spoke of respect for human rights and peaceful transition, a clear sign that the ship was sinking and no one wanted to go down with it. The isolation of corrupt leaders was becoming complete, both internally and externally. A symbolic moment sealed the fate of the old regime, the toppling of a statue of a former dictator, or the peaceful occupation of the headquarters of state television, once a propaganda instrument, and now a channel for the voice of the people. These acts, broadcast live throughout the country and the world, represented the definitive breaking of the symbolic power of the oppressors, the materialization of the popular victory that had been unequivocally announced. The turning point came when large numbers of security forces, including army units, began to lay down their weapons or openly declare their support for the protesters. Soldiers embraced citizens, police officers were applauded for refusing to crack down. The backbone of state repression had been broken, undermined by the conscience of its members or by the simple recognition of the inevitability of the change sweeping the country. The vast wealth accumulated through years of plunder now seemed like dust in their trembling hands. The secret vaults in Switzerland, the luxury properties in foreign capitals, none of these could buy back the power that was slipping away like sand through their fingers. The loneliness of absolute power was turning into the loneliness of humiliating defeat, their greed and cruelty exposed before the eyes of the world. And then came the image that would remain etched in the nation's memory, a once all-powerful leader, his face pale and his shoulders hunched, being escorted from his palace not by an honor guard but by representatives of the people he had so despised. Fear had shifted. Theirs was now the silence of the defeated, while the loud joy of freedom echoed through the once oppressed streets, heralding a new dawn. News of the popular triumph in Ibrahim Traoré's nation spread across borders with the speed of a fire in a dry savanna, carried by radio waves, social media and enthusiastic eyewitness accounts. Across the African continent, where similar realities of corruption and misgovernance afflicted millions, the story resounded like a thunderbolt of hope. It lit a flame in the hearts of many who felt forgotten and powerless in the face of their own oppressors. The seeds of discontent that had lain dormant in other nations under the weight of repression and apathy began to germinate vigorously. The courage shown by a brotherly people, the image of previously untouchable leaders being held accountable, served as a powerful catalyst. People began to ask themselves, if they could do it, why can't we? The question hung in the air, charged with a bold new possibility. Suddenly, squares in distant capitals, from Dakar to Nairobi, from Luanda to Cairo, began to fill with inspired citizens. The methods varied, the specific demands reflected local realities, but the spirit was the same: an end to corruption, a call for dignity, a deep desire for governance that served the people, not a predatory elite. The Traoré effect was spreading, defying the geography and particularities of each nation. Leaders in other African countries, watching with growing alarm, tried to anticipate the storm. Some hastily announced anti-corruption programs, others offered crumbs of political reform in a desperate attempt to quell the popular anger they felt growing. But in many places, these maneuvers were met with skepticism and disdain, seen as cynical attempts at self-preservation rather than a genuine desire for change. The dream of a truly sovereign, united and prosperous Africa, a dream cherished by generations since the days of the struggle for independence, seemed to be rekindled with renewed force. The narrative that the continent was doomed to exploitation and mismanagement began to be challenged not by intellectuals at faraway conferences, but by the direct action of ordinary citizens on the streets. African youth, in particular, felt like protagonists of this new continental awakening. Ordinary people, through messaging groups and online platforms, began to connect across borders, sharing experiences, peaceful protest tactics, and words of encouragement. An informal network of Pan-African solidarity was created, a grassroots movement that transcended the divisions imposed by colonial maps and narrow political interests. This was the real, vibrant, diverse Africa finding its collective voice. The old colonial powers and the new global actors who had long exploited the continent's divisions and instability for their own gains watched with a mixture of concern and apprehension. A united, strong and rights-conscious African continent represented a challenge to a status quo that had served them well. Their diplomats and analysts struggled to grasp the scale and potential consequences of this transformative wave. A wave of change, multifaceted and adapted to each local context, but united by a common thread of hope and a rejection of endemic corruption, was sweeping across the continent. It was not a homogeneous movement, nor led by a single central figure, but rather a symphony of diverse voices calling for a better future. Ibrahim Traoré had become a symbol, but the real force lay in the awakened consciousness of millions of Africans. There was a sense in the air that a historic turning point had been reached, not just for one nation, but potentially for an entire continent. The narrative of a passive and suffering Africa was being rewritten in real time, by Africans themselves, with the ink of courage, resilience, and an unshakable faith in the possibility of building more just and equitable societies. The world watched, some with admiration, others with fear, but no one indifferent. The future, while promising, was not without its dangers. The fall of old regimes did not automatically guarantee the emergence of democratic paradises. There was a risk that the power vacuum would be filled by new forms of authoritarianism, or that old rivalries, previously suppressed, would resurface violently. Vigilance and continued participation by the people would be crucial to consolidating the gains and avoiding painful setbacks. The dust of the revolution began to settle, revealing a panorama of euphoria and, at the same time, immense responsibility. The joy of having achieved freedom was palpable in the streets, in the smiles, in the hugs between strangers who recognized each other as brothers in the struggle. But beneath the celebration hovered a sober awareness of the long and arduous road ahead, a road of national reconstruction and healing. Ibrahim Traoré, now a central figure in the transition, along with the new leaders emerging from the popular movement, faced a monumental challenge. It was not just a matter of replacing people, but of profoundly transforming the structures of a state corroded by corruption and inefficiency. Institutions had to be rebuilt, laws had to be rewritten, and people's confidence in the very idea of government and public service had to be restored. The most difficult task, perhaps, was to dismantle the intricate web of corruption that had infiltrated all levels of society, like a cancer with deep metastases. It would require courage to investigate and punish the guilty, even those who tried to present themselves as new allies, and resilience to resist the inevitable sabotage attempts by remnants of the old regime, who would not give up easily. In addition to internal challenges, there was also the shadow of external pressures. Forces that benefited from the old status quo, both regional and international, could seek to destabilize the new government, foment divisions, or impose conditions that would limit hard-won sovereignty. The new leadership would need diplomatic savvy and the unwavering support of its people to navigate these turbulent and dangerous waters. Maintaining popular fervor and channeling that energy into constructive participation in the new governance was essential. The revolution had not ended with the fall of the tyrants. It had only just begun. It was necessary to create mechanisms for citizens to be able to monitor power, participate in decision-making, and ensure that the ideals that had brought them to the streets were not betrayed by a new elite, however well-intentioned. The process of healing the social wounds, divisions and traumas left by years of oppression and injustice would be slow and delicate. It would require dialogue, reconciliation, and a conscious effort to build a society based on mutual respect, inclusion, and justice for all, without exception. The memory of the past should serve as a lesson, not as a burden that impedes progress towards a shared future. Despite everything, the first signs of positive change were beginning to emerge, like green shoots on scorched earth. Small improvements in public services, the beginning of legal proceedings against notorious figures of corruption, the opening of spaces for free debate and citizen participation. These were modest steps, but they fed hope and demonstrated a real commitment to the popular aspirations that had brought down the dictatorship. Constant vigilance would be the watchword. Freedom, once conquered, needs to be nurtured and defended daily against internal and external threats. Each citizen became a guardian of this new era, aware that rights and dignity are not gifts, but achievements that require permanent commitment and civic courage to be preserved. The story of Ibrahim Traoré and his people's revolution resonated as a message of hope and resilience not only for Africa, but for all peoples of the world who yearn for justice and freedom. It demonstrated that even in the most adverse circumstances, the unity and determination of ordinary people can move mountains and transform reality, defying the predictions of cynics and the powerful. The history book of that nation, and perhaps of the continent, had turned a crucial page. But the story was not over. A new chapter, vibrant and full of possibilities, was just beginning to be written. And the authors of this new narrative would be the citizens themselves, with their calloused hands, their hopeful hearts, and their minds awakened to the power that had always resided within them, waiting for the right moment to manifest itself with all its transformative force. This journey, friends, is a powerful reminder that change, no matter how impossible it may seem, begins with the courage of one and is achieved through the union of many. If this story touched your heart and sparked your reflection, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. Click the like button if you believe in the power of the people and leave your comment below, sharing your impressions and what this story meant to you. Your participation is essential for us to continue bringing content that inspires and transforms. See you in the next video.